Planet America's fake news.
What the hell is going on here?
It's time for another trip to Planet America. Hello, I'm John Barron.
And I'm Chaz Chadolo.
This week, more evidence of a quid pro quo with televised impeachment hearings about to start.
Also this week, Beto bows out and how the open skies might be shut down.
America first is really America alone, and I think that's a dangerous situation for this country to be in.
In the History Department, how a presidential pardon cost Jerry Ford an election.
Most Americans will understand what was done and why it was done.
Turns out they didn't.
That close. But first...
Evidence that President Trump improperly withheld US military aid from Ukraine to pressure them to investigate a domestic political rival continued to mount this week. US Ambassador to the EU, Gordon Sondland, a $1 million Trump mega donor, dramatically changed his story this week.
In a stunning reversal, Gordon Sondland, the US Ambassador to the EU, revising his testimony, detailing a quid pro quo with Ukraine.
Sondland said the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky raised concerns about the suspension of US aid with Vice President Mike Pence at a meeting in Warsaw, Poland on September the 1st. Sondland says he now recalls that after that meeting he spoke individually with Ukrainian National Security Advisor Andrei Yermak and telling him resumption of aid would likely not occur until a public anti-corruption statement was made. Sondland also revealed in more than 400 pages of testimony released by House Democrats this week that he assumed that pressure to investigate the Bidens, Burisma and the debunked conspiracy theory that Ukraine meddled in the 2016 election to damage Trump was, in fact, illegal.
Note that the first time Sondland testified, he said inviting a foreign government to undertake investigation for the purpose of influencing an upcoming election would be wrong. Withholding foreign aid in order to pressure a foreign government to take such steps would be wrong. I did not and would not ever participate in such undertakings. But now he's saying he did participate in such undertakings. And this guy donated $1 million to Trump, so they can't call him a never Trumper. If Sondland's admitting that he tried to arrange a quid pro quo, that is the end of the no quid pro quo defence. Another interesting element from that Sondland quote before, John, it's that he confirms the trade-off was for a public statement. Now, if you were genuinely trying to take down Joe Biden's web of corruption, then you wouldn't announce it publicly, would you? That would only hurt the investigation, because Biden could potentially destroy evidence. Insisting on a public statement suggests to me that you're more interested in publicly smearing Joe Biden than in any potential investigation. So that could undermine Trump's just looking for corruption defence. But what Sondland doesn't provide is any link between the quid pro quo and Trump. Look how vague and passive he gets when asked who told him to execute the quid pro quo. I came to understand that a public statement would be needed. I do not specifically recall how I learned this. Then he backpedaled even further with, I presumed the aid suspension had become linked to the statement. And how vague is this? I still don't know when, why, or by whom the aid was suspended. All that vagueness matters because out of the people who've testified, Sondland is the only one who can actually connect Trump directly to the scandal. You keep going, I'll show you what I mean.
Yes. I wonder if Gordon's going to be coming back to amend that amendment. Transcripts were also released, by the way, from key witnesses, including the US charge d'affaires to Ukraine, Bill Taylor, and the former special envoy, Kurt Volker, one of the three amigos. Volker's testimony revealed the level of animosity President Trump expressed to Rudy Giuliani towards Ukraine, claiming Ukrainians are, quote, all corrupt and, quote, terrible people who tried to take Trump down in 2016.
Okay, this is what I mean. Volker also said that at the time he didn't even know there was a quid pro quo. And when asked whether there was no quid pro quo ever communicated to him at any time, he said, that's correct.
Well, Bill Taylor's full testimony also rather fingered Rudy Giuliani as being the originator of the idea that Zelensky should say out loud he's going to investigate Burisma and the 2016 election, thereby helping President Trump against Joe Biden. And in subsequent answers, Taylor also made it very clear that Giuliani was working on behalf of his client, Donald Trump.
Maybe so, but when asked if he'd ever spoken to Giuliani or been asked to speak to Giuliani, Taylor said no. He also hasn't spoken to the president or spoken to Mick Mulvaney. I mean, some of these questions to Bill Taylor were like the Kevin Bacon game. So Tim Morrison told you that Ambassador Sondland told him that the president told Ambassador Sondland about the investigation. That's correct. Sondland is looking more and more important to me, John.
Yeah, I think you're right. Senior administration figures including outgoing Energy Secretary Rick Perry, Acting Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney and former National Security Advisor John Bolton all ignored requests to appear before congressional investigators this week. Televised hearings start next week on Thursday our time, so this is about to get very, very real. Meanwhile, Republican Senator Lindsey Graham says he won't even read the transcripts of this testimony because as far as he's concerned, the case is already closed.
Do you plan on reading these transcripts that were released?
No. If the person being threatened with withholding the aid, if they say I wasn't threatened, I don't care what any bureaucrat says.
Well, that is a far cry from a month ago when Graham tweeted that if House Democrats refused to release the full transcript of Volcker, it would be an abuse of power. They've sure moved on from that secretive process defence. Now, the defence du jour today is that quid pro quos are good.
There's good quid pro quo, there's bad quid pro quo. This quid pro quo, if it actually was completed, which it wasn't, was a good thing.
And look out for this new take as well.
At the end of the day, people are going to realize there was no investigation of Biden in Ukraine, and the money was delivered.
See, that's the old Mueller defence. Trump may have been trying to commit a crime, but he never quite succeeded. I'll go through some more of those defences in the extra right there.
All right, but for now it is time once again to play
Guess Who Won't Be President?
And this week it is former Texas Congressman Beto O'Rourke who's dropped out of the campaign for the presidency, citing a lack of money.
But we do not have the means to pursue this campaign successfully. And that my service will not be as a candidate nor as a nominee of this party for the presidency.
That was a far cry from the excitement that greeted his entry into the race 7 months ago.
Beto O'Rourke making it official. The former Texas congressman announcing he's running for president in this video message posted on social media.
This is a defining moment of truth for this country and for every single one of us.
O'Rourke saying the interconnected crises of the economy, the climate, and the nation's democracy have never been greater.
O'Rourke had raised a mountain of cash, almost $80 million in his narrow loss to Ted Cruz in the 2018 Texas Senate race. And early on in his presidential bid, he was again raking in the cash, $6.1 million in the first 24 hours. When O'Rourke announced that he was running, he was polling at around 6%. He reached 9.5% to be in third place early in April, but his numbers started sliding when Joe Biden entered the contest in May and have been pretty much stuck between 2 and 3% ever since then. Beto was in 7th place nationally when he dropped out of the race. And as O'Rourke's support dried up, so too did the money. From that bumper first day, he raised $9 million for the first quarter, $13 million in the second quarter, but just $4.5 million for the third quarter. And he was in real danger of missing out on the debates in November and December. It is hard to put your finger on exactly why Beto's campaign didn't take off. His positioning in Biden's moderate lane and a lack of policy specifics drew early criticism, fueling a perception that he didn't really stand for much. O'Rourke possibly fell into that trap of looking like somebody who was running for president for the sake of running for president, because people said he should, not because of any issue larger than himself. In the end, after the El Paso shooting, he did champion a forced buyback of assault weapons. That issue gave him probably his most memorable moment of the campaign.
Hell yes, we're going to take your AR-15, your AK-47. We're not going to allow it to be used against our fellow Americans anymore.
But by then, it seemed that Democrat voters had already made up their minds about Beto O'Rourke. His campaign had pretty much peaked on the day he announced. And he got this send-off from President Trump this week.
Beto, did you hear? Beto. Oh, that poor bastard.
Really appreciate the sympathy.
Yeah.
Look, I agree with your analysis, John. To me, Beto's problem was summed up by something he said in the first week of his candidacy. He'd supposedly spent 4 months thinking about whether he was going to run or not. He comes out with this. O'Rourke asked voters to shape him into the presidential candidate they want him to be. Shouldn't he have known by then? He came right out of the gate with no policies until he ripped a few off other candidates. He seemed to be constantly apologising. He started off moderate, but then went all super woke and gun grabby until some kid challenged him in a town hall, and then he seemed to consider changing his mind back again. Like you said, Beto never seemed to work out why he was running for president, and I think it showed.
Certainly did. There is renewed speculation today, though, that billionaire former New York Mayor Michael Bloomberg is preparing for a White House campaign after all, after he ruled it out earlier this year. The 77-year-old with a personal fortune of a cool $52 billion has staff gathering the signatures required to get on the ballot in Alabama ahead of a filing deadline for their primary tomorrow. He only has until next Friday to get on the ballot in New Hampshire. According to longtime advisor Howard Wolfson, Bloomberg is increasingly concerned that the current field of candidates is not well positioned to defeat Donald Trump. We'll have a lot to say about that in the Planet America Extra. Meanwhile, the major declared Democratic candidates have fronted up at the Liberty and Justice Dinner in Des Moines, Iowa. This 5-hour event involves candidate speeches of around 10 minutes each, rather than the usual short sound bites they get to deliver in debates. And they get to do it in front of a crowd of around 13,000 Democrats. I sat through the whole thing.
Wow.
So that you don't have to. And here are a few takeaways. This is both a show of organisational strength and a big opportunity to reach out to the kind of die-hard voters who can help to propel a candidate to a strong showing in the Iowa caucuses next February. This event, of course, was the one that Barack Obama used as a launching pad in 2007. And one of the candidates generating some Obama-like buzz was the opening act, Mayor Pete Buttigieg, whose speech also echoed Obama's campaign themes of hope and change.
And if talking about hope and belonging sounds optimistic to you for a time like this, fine. Call it optimistic, but do not call it naive. Because I believe these things not based on my age, but based on my experience.
Pete Buttigieg had a lot of his supporters turn up with LED lights, and it certainly put on quite a show. Former Vice President Joe Biden turned 77 this month, so he is more than double the age of 37-year-old Mayor Pete, and he was on just before Biden. So Joe literally jogged out onto the stage to show his youth and vitality. He delivered a now familiar series of attacks on Trump, highlighting his poll dominance over the president.
The reason he's spending so much time with his henchmen running ads against me in a primary, right? This is like a general election. In a primary, is because he knows that I will beat him and beat him like a drum. I promise you.
Kind of a weird performance. Biden was focused on the audience in the Wells Fargo Arena, which was in the round, and so he spent a lot of time with his back to the cameras. So he probably didn't come across as well for the millions watching on TV as he might have done live in the room. Elizabeth Warren also delivered some familiar arguments with her usual determination to fight for change.
If we're going to make the big challenges of our time, then it's going to take big structural change, and that starts with you, Iowa.
Nothing really new from Warren, mostly just talking points we've heard in debates. There was a lot riding on this speech for Senator Kamala Harris, though, who has seen her poll numbers nationally as well as in Iowa heading in the wrong direction for more than 4 months now.
I believe that in 2020, justice is on the ballot.
It's a pretty good performance from Kamala Harris, one of the better ones of the night. All of the candidates except Bernie Sanders dispensed with notes. They were speaking off the cuff, but he actually turned up and spoke behind a lectern, and it gave his speech a very oddly formal feel.
Brothers and sisters, good policy is good politics. Now is the time to stand with the working families of our country.
Brothers and sisters, won't let's call them comrades, Bernie. On last week's program, veteran Iowa reporter David Yepsen suggested that Amy Klobuchar is one of the candidates that more moderate voters in Iowa will be looking to if Joe Biden's support continues to fade, as it has been. And her speech was one of the better received ones on the night, with her own particular argument for electability.
That we have to bring in our fired-up Democratic base, but we also have to bring in independent
As for the rest, including Yang, Castro and Booker, they were all solid overall. No real game changers, no real disasters. But performances to give hope to longer shots like Buttigieg, Harris and Klobuchar certainly were on show. Biden, Warren and Sanders will have certainly pleased their supporters without necessarily offering anything new to people that haven't been won over, I'd say.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see if that does change anyone's momentum, because the trends in Iowa, they've been pretty constant for 3 months now. These are the real Clear Politics polling averages. Sanders, as always, has been polling super consistently, whereas Elizabeth Warren has been rising for 3 odd months, as has Pete Buttigieg, although he's been getting even hotter recently. But the big mover is Joe Biden, down. He's gone from thrashing everyone to 4th place in 6 weeks. And this might be part of the reason. These are some Iowa polling demographics from the New York Times. Warren and Sanders both skew younger, with more support amongst 18 to 29s and 30 to 44s. Buttigieg and Biden, however, both skew older with their support. Buttigieg only slightly, but Biden is dominating amongst the over 65s, which is fine, they often vote. But check out the other end. 2% support for Biden amongst 18 to 29s and 3% support amongst 30 to 44s. Biden's got a problem.
Certainly not down with the kids. There was a bad series of head-to-head polls for President Trump this week, losing to Joe Biden by 9 points in the NBC Wall Street Journal poll, 12 points in the Fox News poll, and a thumping 17 points according to ABC and the Washington Post. That poll also had Warren, Sanders and Buttigieg leading by double digits. In the average of polls for the month of October, Biden led Trump by more than 10 points. Meanwhile, his lead over his fellow Democrats has widened again this week, now just under 9 points ahead of Warren on average. Then Sanders with Buttigieg almost 3 points clear of Harris now.
But now for our... so much. And we've grown used to Elizabeth Warren saying this about Medicare-for-All.
Those at the very top, the richest individuals and the biggest corporations, are going to pay more. And middle-class families are going to pay less.
Now, don't lie. We all assumed she was trying to hide a middle-class tax hike there, didn't we? But this week, she released her full plan and surprise!
It doesn't raise middle-class taxes by 1 penny, not 1 penny.
Warren somehow has a Medicare-for-All program that pays for absolutely everything that's been costed at $59 trillion over 10 years by some, and yet she reckons she can pay for it all without a middle-class tax hike? How? Well, she has all kinds of savings and pay-fors that the internet has been tearing to shreds this week. I'll go through them all in the extra, but right now, I'll just focus on one. Take the $9 trillion that employers are currently using to buy health insurance for their employees. Instead of paying that money to insurance companies, Warren would get them to basically pay that sum to the government, which if you think about it, means that businesses who are doing the right thing now and are currently paying for good health care for their employees will be punished with larger payments to the government. But that's just the short term. In the long term, Warren will even things out, so all businesses pay a certain amount per employee. Now, Bernie Sanders says that's not very progressive because all workers pay the same under Warren. It's not an income-related tax. And Biden's campaign noted that if your employer doesn't pay for your health insurance right now, then that new healthcare payment would become a tax on you, the middle class, which she said she wouldn't do. And Warren is just pretending that an employer payroll tax increase is something else. Now, Elizabeth Warren did not appreciate that.
If anyone wants to defend keeping those high profits for insurance companies and not making corporations pay a fair share in taxes, then I think they're running in the wrong presidential primary.
Woo! And in return, Joe Biden appreciated that even less, saying Warren was being condescending and representing an elitism that says, we know best, you know nothing. If you are only as smart as I am, you'd agree with me. They're playing for keeps now, John.
Shots fired. The last fortnight has seen a wealth of information released about the US economy. To make sense of it, the best number cruncher in the business, Philip Lasker.
What?
Thanks, John. Well, President Trump has been talking up...
Philip, sorry, this is kind of my thing, so if you don't mind just...
you're the finance reporter now?
Well, no, but this is my
Have you got an economics degree?
Well, no.
Have you ever read an economics book or an economics article? Can you even spell the word economics?
Just come here. Thank you. Now, Trump has been talking up the economy.
The greatest economy in American history.
But only hours after that tweet, the latest GDP growth figures came out, and the annualised growth for the third quarter was only 1.9%. In fact, economic growth is now back to the levels Obama oversaw in his final year. If you don't think that's an issue, remember,
there's always a tweet.
I love that theme. Back to 2012.
First quarter GDP has been revised down to 1.9%. The economy is in deep trouble.
And 2012 Trump has a point. Nearly 2/3 of likely voters are saying they aren't better off financially than they were 3 years ago. The manufacturing sector is now contracted for the third straight month. And the Fed has felt the need to cut interest rates 3 times this year alone. Let's face it, 1-point-something% growth is a long, long way from what Trump promised.
And we're bringing GDP from really 1% up to 4%, and I actually think we can go higher than 4%. I think you can go to 5 or 6%.
Wow, that's an even bigger shortfall given Trump passed his tax cuts. Remember how they were going to supercharge business investment? Well, this is business investment, doing pretty much nothing after the tax cuts passed. In fact, the last 6 months, investment growth has been negative. This quarter it's at -3%, the lowest level since 2015. And while the tax cuts didn't spur investment, they sure spurred a budget deficit. Deficits of about $1 trillion a year are taking America right back to the shadows of the GFC. Although, yes, we should be fair here. We should change that headline to be as a percentage of GDP. Fine. Admittedly, those figures, they're not quite so bad. But they're still not great when you've got a $23 trillion federal debt and you're supposedly enjoying
the greatest economy in American history.
Especially given back in 2016, Trump promised to get rid of the entire national debt fairly quickly. He said he'd do it in a period of 8 years. Better get a wriggle on. So does that mean the economy has turned from this into this? Not quite, because the October employment report came out as well, and it wasn't bad. 128,000 new jobs with a revision of 95,000 extra jobs from the previous 2 months, and the unemployment rate only ticking up marginally from 3.5 to 3.6%. Importantly, that number went up for the right reasons, because more people were looking for jobs. This is the share of prime age or 25 to 54-year-olds who are in the labour force. 82.8% of them. That is the highest it's been since 2009. And this is the share of 25 to 54-year-olds who are employed. It's now 80.3% of them, and that's the highest it's been since 2001. So these are good numbers, as are those 128,000 new jobs I talked about. I know it seems a little bit middling, but remember, there were 42,000 lost jobs because of the General Motors strike. You can see them right there in the manufacturing motor vehicles employment figures, and they're all coming back next month. So add them on, and it's a solid result for a tightening labour market. It is, although obviously not solid enough, because Trump not only adjusted the numbers for the GM strike, but he also added on the revisions from the last 2 months as well, and then he added 50,000 more jobs for some reason I don't understand, and he declared that
blowout jobs number of 303,000. USA rocks.
Yeah, and so does making up statistics. Not that he needed to make anything up. We're talking another all-time low in the African-American unemployment rate. And over the past 3 months, the unemployment gap between blacks and whites has been the lowest on record, down to about 2%. So, sure, there are a few economic figures out there at the moment, but there are some decent ones as well. So what does that all mean?
Well, so now you want the person who's actually qualified to explain what's going on. Well,
Come back! My mistake. Sorry. I guess much like this segment, the American economy is not great, but it's not terrible either. It'll do. And on that note, back to the #1 name in news.
Thanks, Chaz. Well, he hasn't been relevant for 165 years, but Millard Fillmore was at one point considered to be one of America's 13 best presidents. Fillmore...
What is this? What are you doing? This is my segment.
Oh, I just thought it'd be nice to have someone present a history that wasn't about Watergate for once.
I think we'll be fine, thanks very much.
Oh, so what is the history about this week?
It's about the pardoning of Richard Nixon after Watergate.
We're standing by now for 37th President.
Thursday, August the 8th, 1974, just before 9 p.m. President Richard Nixon is about to make his 37th address from the Oval Office. He wants everything to run smoothly.
I know. Have you got an extra camera in case the lights go out? Who'd you get it from? Is that an NBC?
This is the camera.
Yeah. He chats and jokes with the director. He's making sure the shot looks good. Richard Nixon hasn't slept more than a few hours in days now.
Let me see that. Get these lights properly. My eyes always have. You'll find if you get past 60, that's enough.
He waves away a still photographer wanting to capture the moment.
My friend Ollie always wants to take a lot of pictures. I'm afraid he'll catch me picking my nose.
Despite the light-hearted banter, Nixon is about to make one of the most consequential announcements of his or any other presidency.
I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow. Vice President Ford will be sworn in as president at that hour in this office.
The following day, after Ford has been sworn in as America's 38th president, he and many others hoped it would bring an end to the Watergate scandal that had consumed American politics for a year and a half.
My fellow Americans, our long national nightmare is over.
In reality, the nightmare was far from over. Richard Nixon had resigned to avoid impeachment and a Senate conviction, but what now? On the day Ford became president, aides to Watergate Special Prosecutor Leon Jaworski drafted a memo examining the arguments for and against prosecuting now former President Nixon. They said there was clear evidence Nixon participated in a conspiracy to obstruct justice, concealing the identity of those involved in the Watergate break-in. They had the tapes to prove Nixon was deeply involved in the cover-up. The Special Prosecutor's Office operated on the presumption Nixon, like every citizen, is subject to the rule of law. So if there is sufficient evidence, he should be indicted and prosecuted. However, Jaworski's office concluded a presumption that therefore Nixon should be prosecuted had to be weighed against indictment and prosecution, an acknowledgement that Nixon wasn't just any citizen. He was a former president, potentially being arrested and ultimately sent to jail for offences committed as president. President Ford had White House counsel Phil Buchan ask Jaworski what a criminal prosecution of Nixon would entail. He was told a trial wouldn't begin for at least 9 months. Around May 1975, the trial itself would be open-ended and potentially overshadow the 1976 bicentennial celebrations and the next election. For several weeks, President Ford agonised over what to do. He had the power to pardon Richard Nixon. Would he use it? Ford was concerned about the mental and physical well-being of Nixon. He was reportedly in a very bad way. He worried the image of an ailing former president being hauled before a court could cause even further damage to the office and the nation. Ford also considered what a pardon meant. According to a 1915 Supreme Court ruling, a pardon carried an imputation of guilt, and accepting a pardon was an admission of that guilt. Ford kept a clipping from that ruling in his wallet. A month after taking office, Ford's mind was made up. He announced,
"A full, free, and absolute pardon unto Richard Nixon for all offenses against the United States which he, Richard Nixon, has committed."
President Ford then signed the pardon for the cameras to see, but to some, it looked like a quid pro quo, a sleazy deal with Nixon. But Ford paid a political price. His approval rating of 71% in mid-August slumped to 50% after the pardon at the end of September and 37% in the new year. In October, Ford became the first president since Abraham Lincoln to testify before the House to deny allegations of a secret deal to pardon Nixon.
And I hope
as I said in my opening statement, Mr. Chairman, that have at least cleared the air so that most Americans will understand what was done and why it was done.
Nixon was out of office and in disgrace, but staying out of jail. Some of his top advisors were not so lucky. In all, 40 government officials were indicted or jailed over the Watergate scandal, including senior staff H.R. Haldeman, John Ehrlichman, Chuck Colson, legal counsel John Dean, former Attorney General John Mitchell, E. Howard Hunt, G. Gordon Liddy. The list went on. Gerald Ford's 2 years and 5 months in office saw the US economy sputter, inflation spike, unemployment hit its highest level since 1941, South Vietnam and Cambodia fall to communists. Ford survived an assassination attempt and a challenge for the Republican nomination from Ronald Reagan, but Jerry Ford could never escape the shadow of Watergate or the pardon of Richard Nixon. In 1976, he lost the presidency to Jimmy Carter, who paid this unusual tribute to Ford at the start of his own inaugural address.
For myself and for our nation, I want to thank my predecessor for all he has done to heal our land.
And in that moment, perhaps, Jerry Ford got his wish. America's long national nightmare of Watergate was finally over.
Now to an international agreement you probably haven't heard of, the Open Skies Treaty. Yes, I know it sounds like an in-flight magazine, but it's been important over the years. The Open Skies Treaty was the brainchild of President Dwight Eisenhower in the 1950s, but it only became a reality under George H.W. Bush in 1992. It requires each country to allow surveillance flights over their land as long as they're given notice of the specific flight path so they can track the planes. And all the photos taken are shared with all the signatories to the treaty. The idea is to create more transparency about both what countries want to know about each other and what they do know. Since it came into force in 2002, there have been over 1,400 surveillance flights conducted by America, Russia and 32 other countries, including every NATO country except for Albania and Montenegro. What are you hiding, Albania and Montenegro? Now, so far, this treaty's worked out pretty well for America, with the US taking 196 flights over Russia up to 2016 compared to Russia's 71 flights over America. But you'll notice that that is archived content. The reason it's archived is because the current administration isn't such a fan of the Open Skies Treaty. In fact, Trump has reportedly already signed a document declaring he would like to withdraw America from the treaty. This is supposedly in response to Russian compliance issues, including Russian interference with American monitoring flights. Although people actually suspect this is more about the influence of the recently departed John Bolton, who genuinely despises international agreements. In fact, Bolton once said, "It's a big mistake for us to grant any validity to international law, even when it may seem in our short-term interest to do so, because over the long term, the goal of those who think international law really means anything are those who want to constrain the United States." During his career, Bolton's been involved in the withdrawal from all of these agreements, and the Open Skies Treaty may be his latest casualty. Or maybe not. The treaty states that you need to give 6 months' notice to withdraw, and not only has Trump not given that notice, but they haven't even held a Security Council meeting to discuss giving that notice. So what does this all mean? Let's ask Alexandra Bell from the Centre for Arms Control and Non-Proliferation. Alexandra, why do you feel the Open Skies Treaty is so important?
The Open Skies Treaty is a 34-nation agreement that allows each country to overfly the territories of the other countries that are a party to the treaty. These flights allow countries to observe military infrastructure and movements and activities, and that kind of information and intelligence, open source intelligence, is valuable, and it lets countries plan security without misinformation or misconceptions about what other countries are doing. It's stabilizing, it provides predictability. It's a treaty that really has been working since 1992 and continues to work despite current problems we're having with the agreement.
Now, I know America has taken advantage of this treaty more than Russia has in the past, but is America still taking advantage of it a lot today?
Absolutely. We do 3 times as many overflights over Russia as Russia does over the United States. And for many countries in the agreement, this is their only ability to collect intelligence and data on Russian troop movements, particularly near the borders between a lot of these Eastern European countries and Russia. So it's incredibly valuable. The U.S. has actually already bid on 22 flights for next year and had those bids approved. So from all accounts, at the working level, the U.S. is still going forward and very much is getting value from the treaty.
With modern satellite technology, can't everyone just spy on everyone else using satellites?
This is something that Open Skies Treaty critics bring up all the time, that people can simply get Google Earth images or the U.S. could simply give imagery to other countries. First and foremost, Open Skies is more than just the data that's collected. It gives countries the ability to see what other countries want to photograph in their countries. There's also a lot of cooperation that goes into the overflights that's valuable, that creates connections between different countries. And further, the members of the treaty don't want to become intel client states to either the United States or a corporation. They want to be able to gather their own intelligence. It's actually really useful to have multiple images collected by various countries when we are actually confronting any member of the treaty with potential malfeasance. Multiple sources of information, particularly in this time of weaponized disinformation, is actually very useful to us.
Have there been any particular moments that you can think of when this treaty saved countries from the risk of conflict?
It's been very useful in Ukraine at this current time of crisis. About a year ago, there was an incident in the Sea of Azov. The Ukrainians actually came to the United States and other members of the treaty to conduct an extraordinary overflight to get clear and undisputed information about what was happening in the Sea of Azov at the time. That wouldn't be possible without the Open Skies Treaty.
Well, what's the main argument against the Open Skies Treaty?
They're twofold. There are some compliance issues that we're having with the treaty because of Russian activities, particularly Russian enforcement of a 10-kilometer border around the breakaway publics of South Ossetia and Abkhazia in Georgia. But actually, that's not a problem with the treaty. It's the treaty itself says if there are states that are not a party to the treaty that are adjacent to treaty members, there has to be this 10-kilometer boundary. So if Russia is going to go and maintain that those 2 breakaway republics are in fact independent states, it has to enforce that treaty boundary. There's another a flight limitation that Russia is trying to enforce over Kaliningrad, but there again it had to do with some disputes about potentially misusing the treaty to kind of disrupt commercial flight over Kaliningrad. So these are actually not atypical problems to come up in the implementation of an arms control agreement, and they are solvable, and all parties to the treaty seem interested in solving those problems. So, critics about Open Skies saying that maybe the U.S. should withdraw from the treaty seem to be ignoring what our treaty partners are saying, most of whom are U.S. allies.
Now, this involves 34 countries. If America withdraws, would you expect the whole framework to fall apart, or would it continue on without America?
I'm afraid it would collapse because I think the Russians would see little reason to stay in the treaty if it couldn't overfly U.S. territory, in which case it would most likely withdraw from the treaty, and then the other parties to the treaty wouldn't really have a reason to go on. It's really the access to either the U.S. or Russia that makes the treaty particularly valuable to all parties.
And is this the kind of thing where the rest of the world might wait 12 months to see if Trump loses the election and then America just rejoins the treaty without too much damage being done?
If the U.S. leaves this treaty, you're basically looking at the complete breakdown of conventional arms control in Europe. We have problems with the Conventional Forces in Europe treaty that was very important of kind of clearing out the ash and trash of the Cold War, but has since really stumbled and needs revitalization for modern military problems that we have on the European continent. The Open Skies Treaty has been working. If it falters, you really don't have a lot holding together your Atlantic security anymore, nor do you have a lot of focus in either Washington or Moscow in what would come next. How do we maintain the kind of stability and predictability we were getting out of these conventional arms control agreements if everyone is just free to do whatever they want and no one has any ability to do any observations or checks.
Alexandra, this is what, the 5th arms control treaty that John Bolton has been involved with withdrawing from? How much do you hate that guy?
John Bolton and I, Ambassador Bolton and I, clearly have different views about the value of arms control treaties, but I think time and again we've proved that America first is really America alone, and I think that's a dangerous situation for this country to be in. We really should be taking into account the views of the people whose views we agree with, who have the same kind of ideas about how to secure the world, not just for our own countries, but for everyone. And hopefully, now that he has left the White House and some of his underlings have also left the White House, there'll be less of a push to withdraw from these kinds of agreements.
As you noted, this is only one of the arms control treaties that the Trump administration has attempted to withdraw from. You're in the arms control game. Which treaty do you think was the most ill-advised to leave?
I would probably say the most ill-advised move was the withdrawal from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action with Iran. That agreement was working. It was blocking all of Iran's paths to a possible nuclear weapon, and withdrawing against the advice of our allies and the president's own military and diplomatic advisors really defies reason and logic. And what we've seen is actually a worsening of the conditions in the Middle East and no clear path to get Iran back into a nuclear agreement. And so I would say that's probably the most problematic. The one that really worries me is the potential expiration of the New START treaty. The president has it within his authority to extend that treaty along with President Putin for up to 5 years before the expiration on February 5th, 2021. If they fail to do that, if the president continues to drag his feet on that particular extension, there'll be no controls over U.S. and Russian strategic nuclear arsenals for the first time in over 50 years. That's an incredibly dangerous situation for the whole world, and we could potentially be looking at a brand new nuclear arms race.
Alexandra Bell, thanks for visiting Planet America.
Thanks for having me.
And that is it for another week, Chad.
Unless you want to catch a Planet America Extra on iView, YouTube and Facebook. Of course you will. So much more to talk about.
Okay, bye.
Bye.